Hi, everyone. Good afternoon.
Hi.
All right. We're just going to wait a few more minutes and see if other people join in before we get started. Okay. All right, well, let's get started. I'm Mike Tasto. I'm the treasurer for the NRHC. Thank you guys for coming. And we're going to start off, we'll follow the program. Selena from Fairleigh Dickinson is up first. You want to take the floor?
Sure. Let me just share my screen.
Okay. We'll go about like 15 minutes each, and then 5 minutes for questions at the end, and then we'll have some time at the end as well.
All right. So my presentation is essentially on transforming the criminal justice system. And so the criminal justice system has problems in all facets of the system. These stages are actually all interconnected, creating a perpetual cycle in which individuals are sent to prison, get released, and then are expected to return within 3 years. So I will go through the investigative stage and possible solutions, the sentencing stage and possible solutions, and the reintegration stage and possible solutions. So the investigative stage in the United States, the read technique is predominantly used in every federal, state, and local law enforcement agency. But the problem with the read technique is that it's highly confrontational, and the direct purpose is to obtain confession rather than acquire information. And the suspect is typically placed in a stressful position that can induce false confessions or admitting guilt when guilt is not actually there. And the interrogator asks to maintain psychological control using psychological manipulation by asking yes or no questions. And this manipulation can stem from the US Supreme Court also allowing the police to lie or trick suspects, like pretending they have eyewitness testimony or evidence that actually doesn't exist. And this is actually banned in some European countries. And the problem with the read method is, I want to highlight 3 things, which is repetition, length, and stress. So when somebody is told that they're guilty of something and they refute the claim, police are taught to ignore that claim and to repeat that allegation over and over again. But the problem with this is that it creates confusion within the suspect, and it could lead them to actually think, well, maybe I did have to do something with it, and it could lead them to possibly commit to an act that they never actually committed. The second problem with it is that interrogations are very lengthy. So if conducted over a long period of time, this can lead to stress, physical exhaustion, sleep deprivation, and can contribute to mental confusion, which then allows for doubts in one's account and makes it easier to give into suggestibility, which also, again, leads to false confessions. And the final thing is that it leads to stress. So during interrogations, police officers purposefully sit close to a suspect and invade their personal space in order to create a guilty suspect a certain degree of relief and confidence. But this is used to create a duplicitous nature and trust between a police officer and a suspect, and also to get information about a suspect. And whilst to some it might elicit confidence and trust, to others it may elicit stress, which can again put doubts in one's account and lead to suggestibility, which then leads to false confessions. So what can we do about it? A possible solution is investigative interviewing, which is essentially a non-coercive method of interviewing suspects. And in the United Kingdom, they have the peace model, which is less confrontational. It focuses on gathering information and uses open-ended questions. And again, they avoid deceit and manipulation in any way. It focuses on gathering information rather than just asking yes or no questions, or rather than just obtaining a confession. And in Norway, they have the creative model, which is actually based off of the peace model. And in this model, the police gather information, police adopt an open attitude to information, and interviews do not use force, confessions, or confirm suspicions or anything like that. And the principle of everyone is innocent until proven guilty is put into practice. And the creative model has actually been so successful that they've brought the person who created it to the UN to actually speak about its effectiveness. And I just wanted to highlight a point with the creative model, that in 2011, there was a terrorist attack that killed 77 people in Norway by Anders Breivik. And they sort of went through a ticking time bomb scenario, which is an ethical scenario or a thought experiment using ethics to debate whether torture can ever be justified, because the suspect who killed the 77 people, he said, "What you have seen today here is just the beginning. This is not the operation. It is only firecrackers compared to what will happen. Cell 2 and 3 will activate in the near future." And so it sort of tested the investigative interviewing methods of Norway, but they decided to stick with their method, and he was interviewed 31 times over a period of 9 months, totaling about 220 hours. But every second was recorded. The suspect was informed and reminded of his human rights. In the opening of each interview, his lawyer was present at all times, and it actually proved to be effective, because when the trial started, the suspect stated that he regretted having actually said too much. So it really brings into question that when your methods are tested after an egregious act has committed, you can still do the right thing and get a good outcome. So part 2 of a problem is the sentencing stage. So the accused who are unable to afford a lawyer are provided with a public defender. But the problem with this is that these lawyers are often overworked and underpaid, and therefore cannot help in the best way possible, or cannot, have efficient time to create a adequate defense for their client. And another problem is mandatory minimums, which make it difficult for first-time offenders to get leniency. Time given for the drug convictions can actually exceed the crimes of rape, pedophilia, and even terrorism. And the problem with mandatory minimums is that they impact minorities the most, especially Blacks and Hispanics. An example I can give is marijuana. It has been associated with Hispanics and Blacks, despite the fact that Blacks and whites smoke it at the same rate. Usually Blacks and Hispanics get put into jail more because of it. And Congress actually established mandatory minimums with the intention of locking up high-level drug offenders, but they actually just consist of 11% of those in prison right now. And a provision of the law allows offenders to receive lesser sentences by providing substantial assistance with the case, and through the form of setting up suspects or snitching on others, essentially. But since high-level drug offenders have no knowledge of value, they usually are able to reduce their sentence, but people who are actually put in jail for mandatory minimums are usually low-level offenders or first-time offenders. And since they usually have no knowledge of value, they actually serve longer sentences than high-level offenders. And after the sentencing stage, individuals go to prison. But there's also a problem with the prison system. So in the 1980s, after the war on drugs occurred, state and federal prisons were getting too crowded. So the Corrections Corporations of America, or CCA, they was created in order to take care of locking up prisoners, save prisons money, and actually take a profit for themselves. But the problem with this is Tom Beasley, the co-founder of CCA, stated, "You just sell prisons like you were selling cars or real estate or hamburgers." In addition, prisons exploit prisoners. So 1/5 of prisoners are held in a for-profit facility. And one study found that private prisons gave out twice as many infractions than government ones because they can lengthen one sentence and then get money for themselves and save money in the process as well. And private prisons sneak occupancy laws into their contracts, which require states to keep prisons full. And when Arizona did not fulfill to make their 97% capacity quota, then they had to pay a government fine of $3 million. So seeing this, you can really see that the prison system really sees people as a profit, something to really get money off of. And the fact that this happens really dehumanizes and devalues individuals, which makes it easier to sort of commit these egregious acts. Besides prisons, another thing that is appalling is just really the solitary confinement. So solitary confinement was actually banned by the Supreme Court in the 1890s because they deemed it too cruel. They said that prisoners became violently insane and committed suicide. But as we know, it's still a tool used today, and it was actually reintroduced a couple of decades ago. And the problem with solitary confinement is that humans need to interact. We're social creatures. We need to interact in order to function. And the lack of social contact which actually occurs in solitary confinement because you're put in a size that's roughly the size of a king-size bed. It's been found to cause serious and permanent brain damage because inmates hallucinate, they develop depression, and they lose track of time. But I think the most appalling act of solitary confinement is that it's actually not meant for the worst criminals. It's whoever the guards don't want to deal with. And this includes people from the LGBTQ+ community, the mentally ill, and people who simply don't want to eat their food. And I think Khalif Browder is a great example of the harms of really solitary confinement. He was arrested for an alleged robbery, but after his inability to meet bail, he was imprisoned at Rikers Island, where he was repeatedly assaulted by both the inmates and the officers. And he spent nearly 2 years in solitary confinement and developed depression. And he tried to commit suicide twice unsuccessfully. When he got out, he stated that he felt that he was robbed of his happiness and unfortunately committed suicide in 2013. So I think there's a lot of changes throughout the sentencing stage and the prison system that we need to go through. And one of the possible solutions is judicial discretion. About 95% of the cases in court actually are solved by plea bargains. So if there's judicial discretion, judges should determine appropriate sentences instead of lawmakers, prosecutors, and law enforcement officers. And there should be a strengthened prevention and treatment programs. A 1997 RAND study actually found that treatment of heavy drug users was 8 to 9 times more cost effective than long 6 to 7 year mandatory sentences in reducing drug use, sales, and drug-related crime. And I know this study is old, it's from 1997, but repeated studies have shown about the same thing, that rehabilitation works more than punishment. And the reintegration stage, people who are convicted of a crime serve a life sentence in a sense because some ex-inmates cannot even apply for loans to earn an education. Others are rejected from housing, and some are even discriminated in job interviews. So most people serve a life sentence, and even if they just are in prison for a small amount of time. So a possible solution can be aims to rehabilitate offenders instead of punish them. So restorative justice is the aim to give those responsible for and affected by the harm caused by the crime, so the victims, the perpetrators, and the friends or family members, a central role in the process of deciding what needs to be done by way of reparation. And of course, there are problems with restorative justice. It can put pressure on the victims. It doesn't efficiently find a way to help victims deal with their trauma. But the fact that we're focusing on rehabilitation instead of punishment is a step in the right direction. And looking to Norway, this is not just, I chose Norway, but their prison system is similar to that of the Nordic countries. So it's really looking at the Nordic countries' ways of prison systems and how they utilize the prison systems to rehabilitate the offenders. So Halden Prison is just an example, and it's located in Norway, and it tries to maintain normalcy after people are locked up in prison. So for Norway, removing people's freedom is enough punishment. So Halden seeks to prepare inmates for life on the outside with vocational programs such as woodworking, recording studios, and assembly workshops. So as you see, they have windows, they have books to read, they have televisions even in some. And of course, not all Norway prisons are like this. Some actually have bars, but it is a step in the right direction. So conclusion, as one can see, the criminal justice needs to be fixed urgently. I have only accounted for a small portion of the vast problems currently plaguing it, because there's several. We can talk about police training, all of that. But however, one can see that there is hope in fixing what sometimes seems like impossible problems. If we educate and implement, change is possible. And I think throughout this presentation, I think a big sort of takeaway you can is human dignity. Like, what is it and how does it define our system? I think human dignity is not even present in our system. So human dignity, if you don't know, it's the recognition that human beings possess a special value of intrinsic to their humanity, and as much are as much worthy of respect simply because they are human beings. And so if there is a system that sees prisoners as money, as a way to make a profit, if you focusing on punishing people for taking or doing drugs instead of focusing on why they turn into drugs in the first place, if you focus on stripping people of their rights, of their dignity, instead of helping them, then I don't think change is possible. I think you need to look at sort of the mindset of the system and of society as a whole, and how do they view prisoners? How do they view the prison system? How do they view criminal justice system? Is there human dignity present? And I feel like if we focus more on educating and of learning human dignity and implementing it in our system, because it is present in our system. A lot of social change in contemporary society, such as the Black Lives Matter movement and the kids in cages, it's focusing on human dignity. It's respecting people. It's, giving them the same rights as others. And so it is present even in our amendments. It's just, it's not a part of our process policy making or our laws. And I feel like if we implement that human dignity into our society, then I think change is possible. So thank you.
All right, thank you, Selena. Nice job. Just a quick question. Do you think all criminals or inmates, prisoners should be treated equally? Like, should murderers or rapists be treated differently than people with, drug possessions?
That's an interesting question, because like if I put myself in a scenario where, say, somebody murders somebody that I love, I'd probably be very bitter toward that. But I see, going back to what happened in Norway, most of the prisoners there, I meant most of the victims, and the family of the victims, they thought that we should address vengeance with love, not hatred. They don't want to, because when you address it with love, you open democracy, you're opening humanity, you're really addressing that. And they didn't want to address their event like the United States addressed 9/11, because they didn't think vengeance had anything to do with that. And so I think that's a sort of an interesting viewpoint that I kind of sort of like, because, after, a terrible event is going to occur, you're going to be bitter. You're going to hate that person, you're going to feel vengeance. But I think mercy is something that we really need to focus on. It's really like, if you give people the opportunity to truly change, then it can happen. People constantly surprise you. And I think we should give them that chance. And so I think, yeah, even if they are murderers, they should be treated equally.
About what you said in the beginning with the Reed interrogation method. Something that stuck out to me when you were talking about it, lying to the people being interrogated and making up evidence that doesn't exist or confessions that don't exist. And it stuck with me because I've watched tons of Criminal Minds and NCIS and all these other shows where the people that we're rooting for are using these dehumanizing high pressure techniques, and we're like, yeah, you're so smart, get them. Have you given any thought to the way that the media portrays the criminal justice system and how that affects how we as a country see the lack of human dignity?
Yeah, I think the problem with shows as well is that it perpetuates stereotypes, such as, if you look at TikTok, it also perpetuates myths or stereotypes, just like social media does. So I think, yeah, a problem is that TV shows such as Law and Order SVU, Law and Order, and such, they perpetuate stereotypes that actually aren't the case. And people would just sort of watch TV and they sort of think, oh, well, that's what it is. And I think that's dangerous. So I think that we need to educate people on how, the dangers of it. And I think TV shows are actually trying to do that nowadays. So yeah, I do think that that's a problem.
Hi, Selena. I have a really quick question for you. Great presentation.
Sure.
Do you think now that, especially in the state of New Jersey, since marijuana is now legalized, do you think that in terms of reform for the laws for possession are going to change? Like, do you think that they're going to, instead of being criminalized, are going to be turned to more, I guess, supportive and like looking into like substance abuse and that kind of a thing?
Yeah, I think legalization in marijuana particularly is a big step, because it was actually associated with Mexican Americans in the 1940s, despite the fact that it actually hasn't killed anyone. And it actually isn't harmful. It's only dangerous to people whose brains aren't fully developed. And so I think the fact that it's being legalized and accepted is a step in the right direction, because it's sort of putting into question, some drugs, they're not bad. Some of them, they're just associated with that, or they're demonized, or there's sort of a stigma behind them. And I think that the fact that they're being accepted, I think there is going to be sort of a look towards the law, look towards substance abuse. And yeah, I do think it's going to help. I think education is probably the most important thing that one needs to focus on, because when you educate yourself about a certain topic, whether it be drugs, mental health, or the criminal justice system, you can really learn misconceptions about racism, taking drugs, or drugs themselves. So.
All right, thank you, Selena. We'll have maybe some questions at the end as well. Catherine, are you ready to present?
Yes.
All right, good luck. Thanks.
Thank you. So as I'm talking, feel free to interrupt me, because I'm going to be talking to you guys throughout the presentation, asking you guys questions. Let me just share my screen. Okay. So decriminalization is not enough. Addiction as mental health. So who am I? Who am I to talk about addiction, mental health? I'm somebody that's worked on both sides of the addiction epidemic. I am somebody that is in long-term recovery. I have 8 years clean and sober, and I currently work as an addictions recovery counselor. I have a lot of experience on both sides of the coin, and that is where I'm speaking from. So when talking about this, I want to talk to you a little bit about my addiction recovery, to highlight kind of like what that looks like and how I benefited that others might not be able to benefit. So I started very young. I started at 14. I spiraled very quickly into drug addiction. I was addicted to crack cocaine, methamphetamines. I was injecting drugs, smoking drugs, freebasing drugs. I was doing anything that I could get my hands on. I was at a point where my quality of life was really determined by what drugs I was able to get. And so I suffered from PTSD due to abuse that occurred while I was using, from things that I did in order to get drugs. And so I was lucky enough to be able to seek mental health care, detox, and rehab. So I want to talk about my recovery journey to point out some things to you that you might not know necessarily about drug addiction and recovery. When I first got clean, I was put into a mental hospital. So I went to the emergency room and they put me into a mental hospital. While I was in the mental hospital, I didn't receive any substance abuse treatment or care like that. I was released. I went back to the mental hospital. The mental hospital actually sectioned me for problematic use. I was supposed to go to a day program. They said that my use was a danger to myself, and so they sectioned me and they would not let me leave the mental hospital. Once I was there, I was looking around me and I saw these young men that were also in there with me who were just using marijuana. And I don't say just to minimize it, but I was a very traumatized person using hard drugs. Obviously, marijuana is what we would consider a softer drug. and they were going to send them to detox. Now, I hope that everyone here knows that you cannot detox from marijuana. You can experience emotional withdrawals, but it is not, you do not need to go to a detox program for that. So I had to kind of convince them to send me to a detox so I could get drug help. I was lucky enough to go to detox, who referred me to a rehab. So I spent 3 months in the rehab, and I had spent 3 months in the mental hospital and detox. So it was over 6 months in the system. And I want to just point out that that is a rare story, that I was able to get all of that care. There are so many barriers to treatment, especially going to detox, going to rehab. And so I want to point out the privilege in my recovery first and foremost. So what you'll see in this story, however, is that my addiction was treated as a mental health problem. And from this, I've been able to have a sustained recovery. I have been clean for 8 years this year. I was able to go to a program that is called a recovery high school after I got out of rehab. And that was a program that was focused on mental health. It was a high school, but it was also very focused on mental health and helping people to maintain their sobriety. And so going forward, I would like you to have this mind work, this mind frame of addiction as mental health and how it can be successful if we give people the ability to access the resources that they need. So 10% of US adults have drug use disorder at some point in their lives. This is millions of people. And out of all of these people, how many people are able to get help? Only 75% of people report not receiving any kind of treatment for their drug addiction. So that means only about 25% of these people are getting any kind of treatment. Now, this data is for any kind of treatment. This is not just drug-specific treatment, which you will find is actually harder to get. A lot of times you will be referred to a mental hospital, such as I was. And I want to ask you, is there anyone in the audience that knows anyone that has a drug addiction problem, has been to rehab, detox? Okay. So what is privilege in recovery? Why is discussing privilege in recovery important? So in recovery, everybody's going to have a different starting point. So some people will be like me, they'll get treatment very young. Other people, they're going to be, in their 30s, they'll have displaced children, they'll be homeless. Now, privilege in recovery is anything that makes your recovery easier. So you will see in my recovery story, I had a lot of privilege because I had support of my family. I had access to health insurance. And I was able to go to detox and rehab for no money out of my parents' pockets due to their health insurance. So in order to recover, you'll find that you need some amount of privilege because getting access to help isn't always easy. The programs that we have currently ignore many of these issues, which I'm about to cover. When you receive treatment, it means leaving your work if still employed, anywhere from a week to 6 months. Now, not everyone is going to be able to have that. A lot of people don't have paid leave. A lot of people will not have a job when they come back. I mean, the idea of having a paid leave is like incredible. That would be a job that is, has great benefits. I think most people will be unemployed. Some people will have jobs that they show up to sporadically. And if these jobs have any other reason to fire these people, they can. Because if you're someone in active use, it's very hard to maintain your life. So many people will end up unemployed, if not already. And then there's the issue of health insurance. So the uninsured may not be covered. Insured may pay co-pays and deductibles. These can be more expensive than drug fines. not to mention childcare. So if you're somebody that still has their children when you're going into treatment, who's going to take care of your children? What if you don't have connections to your family and so you're unable to access childcare? Where will your child go? If you are entering voluntarily, you don't have many options. If you're being forced to go in, then your child may end up, a ward of the state. And so, not to mention the ability to access resources. So imagine not having internet access, phone access, or transportation. How are you going to get yourself to treatment on your own? Not to mention there are few beds available, and getting into rehab without drugs or alcohol in your system can be near impossible. There are a lot of detoxes that require you to have heroin, alcohol, etc. in your system in order to accept you. Again, I was lucky enough that I went to a detox that was more skills-based and was for young people and did not expect that. But there are people who will go to the hospital, they'll be on drugs, and by the time they are calling detoxes, maybe a day or two after they have stabilized these people, they no longer have it in their system. And so I have seen in my personal experience people being told to do drugs in order to get into detox. Now let's talk, what is the cost of treatment? Now these are the costs without insurance coverage. This is what the insurance will be billed. So drug detox, 30 days. That'll be $240 to $850 per day. Now multiply 850 times 30. Now you can see like these kinds of bills that somebody would deal with if they don't have insurance, they don't have any other options. And this is what the insurance is being billed. Now think about the cost of your average deductible. Now my deductible currently is $4,000. So if I go into detox right now, with my insurance plan, it is not covered. We will pay a deductible of $4,000 in order for me to receive treatment. And that is having a good insurance. So outpatient care, $1,000 to $10,000, intensive outpatients, $3,000 to $10,000, residential, $5,000 to $80,000. Now, of course, $80,000 is more of these celebrity detoxes, but you can see the cost here. Now, what are options for individuals with no insurance? Well, we have state-funded rehab, again, long wait lines. Faith-based rehabs, availability. Free coverage at community health centers or clinics, availability. They won't even be in every neighborhood. Scholarships or grants, again, there will be a cost to the client, to the individual. So, it might be great to help, but they might not have the money. Subsidized coverage, again, cost. Sliding scale payments, again, a high cost. So even though it's being reduced, these people might not have the money. A sliding scale payment and the rehab now, pay later, family and friends, or savings, it counts on family and friends having a large amount of disposable money ranging from thousands to tens of thousands, or counting on someone who is in active addiction to have that much money laying around. Now, there's a saying in AA, it goes, addiction ends in jails, institutions, or death. Now, why do we say that? It's because without proper access to mental health care, you're likely to end up in a jail or dead. Why? Drugs are criminalized. They're not regulated. So you're going to end up getting bad drugs. You can end up dead. Institutions, a lot of drugs, if you get a bad drug, you can lose your mind. And not to mention the 76% of jail inmates that are charged with drug-related crimes suffer from at least one mental health issue. So the rate of comorbidity of addiction and mental health issues is so high. So now let's talk about the most recent attempt to solve this problem. Oregon's attempt to solve this problem. The Drug Addiction Treatment and Recovery Act made Oregon the first state to decriminalize hard drugs such as heroin, cocaine, and meth, switching Oregon from a punitive criminal approach to a more humane one. Now, what is Measure 110? The law reduces penalties for possession of larger amounts of drugs and redirects marijuana tax revenue towards services and programs aimed at addressing drug addiction in Oregon. Now, under this law, only small amounts of drugs are decriminalized, such as less than 1 gram of heroin or MDMA, 2 grams of cocaine or methamphetamine, 12 grams of psilocybin mushrooms, and over 40 doses of LSD, oxycodone, or methadone. Now, as we're talking about this, I would like to point out for those non-drug users that this amount of heroin, cocaine, and methamphetamine is incredibly small. Now, like an 8-ball, I believe, is approximately 4 grams. And for someone to have a gram of heroin on them, they're at like the end of their bag. 12 grams of mushrooms, that's a lot of mushrooms. 40 doses of LSD, that's a lot of LSD. But again, you'll see MDMA, cocaine, methamphetamine, heroin, these drugs, although they're decriminalized, they're still highly stigmatized in that only 1 gram of them, which is below average, I would say, for what people are going to have on them, is at the same amount as this insane amount of 40 doses of LSD. That's like an entire sheet of acid. Now, criminal penalties for possession of these amounts are replaced with a fine up to $100, which can be waived if the user is evaluated at addiction recovery centers. Now, why isn't this change enough? First and foremost, I would like to point out that a small fine of $100 may very well be easier to pay for somebody than the co-pays and deductibles they'll have to pay if they go to an addiction recovery center. Now, say they're lucky enough to get into a state-based treatment center through this program that they have, and it's entirely paid for. What if they have children? What if they lose their job? Now, the programs that they have put into place do not deal with the surrounding issues involving the drug addiction recovery. Now, it's a great start, but it's not nearly enough when tackling this issue. Now, decriminalization will send fewer people to prison, but it'll keep sending people to the morgue. Now, why do we say this? Because the drug supply is not being regulated. It is still unregulated. Not only that, but you're not allowing people to have mental health. So they're going to be still suffering from whatever mental health problems that they had prior to using drugs and while on using drugs. So let's talk about the problems with Measure 110. Providing funding directly to treatment centers does not necessarily make treatment more accessible to clients. Individuals may be inclined to pay a $100 fee than to go to treatment, as treatment requires them to suspend their lives with minimal support. The drug amount is unrealistically small. It does not reduce harm from drugs themselves, only harm from criminal charges. What other problems does this not address? Let's talk about what decriminalization looks like. Let's look at Portugal. Now, Portugal's decriminalization of drugs. Now, 1% of Portugal was addicted to drugs. This is millions of people. The decriminalization of all drugs and the implementation of a healthcare-based system, which treats treatment programs, was increased, alongside harm reduction practices and investment in the social reintegration of people with drug dependence. They have a dissuasion committee, which has treatment options, including a 2-week cleanup programs, methadone programs, substitution programs, referral to 12-step programs, and an option for 1-year stay in a therapeutic community. So they have people to deal with social issues. Now, 80% of overdoses, this is decreased, overdoses decreased by 80% following the decriminalization of drugs in Portugal. How does it reduce overdose? Increases access to safe injection sites, increases access to drug checking, opioid substitution therapy is more widely available, reducing the stigma associated with drug use, so individuals are encouraged to seek healthcare treatment and other support. So decriminalization is only the first step. We must create a nationwide program that offers evidence-based treatment, social support, and proper support after treatment ends. Decriminalization must be followed by a restructuring of drug treatment programs and social supports. Decriminalization cannot prevent the spread of more potent and dangerous drugs making their way into our drug supply, such as fentanyl. It is only the first step in preparing the country for legalization. Now, the best example of legalization I have, of course, will be the legalization of marijuana in the United States. We can talk about other countries, but let's look about it here. Now, I'd like to point out these statistics to you. You'll see the decrease in the marijuana arrest rate after marijuana is made legal. What is its effect on crime? Arrests for marijuana possession dropped considerably, dropped nearly 50%. Now, not only that, but the clearance rates in these states for number of cases, not just marijuana cases, was decreased dramatically. Was increased dramatically. So they were able to solve more homicides. You'll see other crimes decreased also alongside the medical marijuana being passed. So the legalization of marijuana led to an overall decrease in crime, not only drug crime. And we have an excerpt here. The introduction of medical marijuana laws leads to a decrease in violent crime in the states that border Mexico. The reduction in crime is strongest for counties closest to the border and for crimes that relate to drug trafficking. In addition, we find that inland states lead to a reduction in crime in the nearest border state. Decriminalization of the production and distribution of marijuana leads to a reduction in the violent crimes in markets that are traditionally controlled by Mexican drug trafficking organizations. I'd like to point out that that also goes to drug dealers in other states. So what now? I'm going to close out by asking, what do you think of the legalization of drugs beyond marijuana? Will this decrease crime, mental illness, and overdose? What needs to be done alongside the legalization? Let me see. I don't know how to stop sharing.
Catherine, I think it's on the share screen if you click on that. Well, actually, I may be able to do it for you. Oh, shoot.
I can pause the share.
Yeah, try that.
Yeah, I paused the share.
Mm,
It only says new share.
okay. Let me see if I can, give me a second here. I'll stop share. Does someone know how to force stop share?
Yeah, it only says new share or resume share.
Since you're the host, you could probably go to participants and it might say like in share there or.
Okay.
You could take away her option as being a host, so then that way it would go back to your screen. And then if you need to, you can make her a host again.
Stop it. No, I'm going to stop it. I could report you, remove you, put you in a waiting room, stop participate. Oh, there it is. Found it. Thank you. All right. Sorry about that. Nice job, Catherine. Thank you for sharing a remarkable story and your opinions on what should be done. Do you think it's a good idea that if we make everything legal?
I would like to see the country slowly move towards legalization. I don't think currently we have the support in the country in order to make this happen in a sustainable way. I think there needs to be a lot of change. I would like to see decriminalization and the support of our mental health care become more stable before we legalize drugs. But I think that legalization is the only way we can ever control our drug supply to stop things such as overdoses, not to mention the sheer amount of revenue that it would produce. And we can see this with medical marijuana.
I had a student in one of my classes who her brother died from her drug dealer, his drug dealer giving him an, intentionally murdering him essentially with bad drugs. So legal, I can see the viewpoint of legalization, making sure that the drugs are safer and they're not going to kill you. But yeah, thank you. Any other comments quickly before we go to our last presenter?
I wonder what family members of those who have lost somebody to an overdose would feel about legalizing, right, these types of drugs that essentially killed their loved ones.
So I can talk a little bit on that. So the organization that I work with, Safe Project US, our founders lost their son to a drug overdose. Now, in this case, the organization I work for, it's not for the legalization of drugs, but they are for that first step. So the decriminalization of drugs also encourages safe drug use. So we encourage the use of fentanyl test strips, which is one way that individuals using heroin are able to better safely use heroin. So they know not the strength necessarily, but if it has fentanyl in it, they know to proceed with caution. The amount of fentanyl in something can be very, very small and kill you. So I think people might have a problem with it, similar kind of like how we were talking about the victims of crime and their families. But I think upon seeing the results from decriminalization and encouraging safe drug use, I think people might come around to viewing an alternative model more favorably.
I also had a comment about the Oregon study and the law of decriminalization of possession. Those numbers really struck me because I work as a pharmacy technician in Maryland, and a lot of those dosages can be prescribed. So for them to like potentially be arrested for possessing something that they can be prescribed is kind of shocking.
Yeah, I agree. I know somewhere in the country you can still be prescribed like that amount of cocaine. I know they it's like legal somewhere for people with really bad depression. So yeah, honestly, it is shocking. And it's unrealistic, and it's like favors hallucinogens, which is very strange.
All right. Well, thank you again, Catherine, for sharing. Andrea, you're up. Good luck.
All righty, thank you. Let's see. Wait, no, wrong one, sorry. No, I need my. Need the PowerPoint one. Are you seeing the Google slide?
It's up there.
Okay, yay. So let's see. I always have a lot of respect for my professors because this is always difficult every time I try to share. All right, so hi everyone, my name is Andrea Faulknor. I attend Notre Dame of Maryland University. So today I am presenting my research on the drug court systems, and the title of my presentation is Proposed Preventative Measures, an Analysis of the Drug Court System and its Effects on Juveniles and Their Families. So a little background on my research. I attended a juvenile delinquency class, and our research, we were supposed to research current criminal justice issues that affected juveniles and adolescents and possible reforms for the future. So I chose to look at the drug court system and how that impacts juveniles and the family of juveniles as well. Some of the studies that I've looked at focused on reintegration of juvenile and adult drug offenders into society, the assessment of family treatment models, and the research, there was research on trauma and how trauma treatment and treatment of PTSD may be something that needs to be more implemented into these drug court programs. So an introduction to drug abuse. So drug abuse is characterized by the repetitive use of drugs due to dependency or addiction. It can be lifelong, and even recovered drug addicts may relapse throughout their lifetime. Drug abuse can result in death, mental illness, poor health, gum disease, brain damage, poor development, collapsed veins, and can also be a risk factor for HIV and AIDS. Some of the most common drugs abused in the US are marijuana, opioids, methylphenidates, amphetamines, depressants, and dextromethorphan, and those are usually found in common cough syrups. So I know here in Maryland, in order to buy them, you have to show your ID that you're 18 and over, but I'm not sure if that's implemented in other states. Drug abuse can also be hereditary and a result of environments. Some people may become addicted the first time using, and others may not become addicted until multiple uses, depending on, again, their environment or hereditary predisposition to addiction or dependency. So drug abuse in families. So here's some research from some of the studies I looked at. So one study found that since 2017, there was reported over 21 million juveniles aged 12 or older needing treatment for substance and drug abuse. In 2016, 28% of child maltreatment cases were related to drug abuse problems in the family. So it was cyclical between like the parents or guardians and the adolescents as well. Drug abuse can increase the likelihood of intrafamily violence and trauma. It can also increase likelihood of neglect and physical or emotional abuse within the family. And it can also have negative effects on mental health. It can introduce developmental problems, especially to the developing children or adolescents that may be introduced to drug usage, and behavioral problems as well. So the adult and juvenile drug court, so I looked at Maryland specifically. So they are typically offered to first-time offending juveniles or adults and subject to the court's assessment. So repeat drug offenders can be, this can be an option for them, but typically it is offered to first-time offenders. So the Maryland Article 8505 is a plea for those brought in for drug possession or criminalization of drug use. And the defendants can request the judge to order the defendant be evaluated for a drug treatment program. And so they plea into the program and must comply with the program in order, like as an alternative to like typical incarceration. There are also sanctions used throughout these programs to ensure compliance, such as incarceration, if you violate or your probation or your plea deal. So this is just an overview of the drug court process. So again, the defendant will be indicted and they will go to court and they can plea into the Article 8505 deal. They can be reviewed and evaluated, and then they would accept the plea deal and have to go into the program. And again, if they could successfully finish the program, depending on how many months or years they have to participate, or they may violate and have to go back through the traditional prosecution process. So some preventative measures, some of the studies I've found looked at risk factors, the context of drug usage, and behaviors. So some risk factors include poverty, poor educational opportunities, low job opportunities, homelessness, abuse again in the family or environment, trauma as a result of the environment, mental illness, and a lack of supervision. Some of the contexts were communities with low resources or poor education, delinquency and drug use in these normalized environments with little to no authority, and negative or harsh conditions that may induce trauma or some type of condition that may lead these juveniles or adults in these families to use drugs. And the identification of behaviors was also important. So particularly in these juveniles, they found nervousness, distancing, a lack of interest in like formally responsibilities like sports or clubs, and disinterest in school or work, and changes in temperaments or behaviors for these children. And some limitations of the current process that these studies found was that some of these sanctions, including incarceration, may not be effective in preventing relapse. There have been several studies outside of drug abuse that show that harsh sentencing is not an adequate deterrent for any type of offending. So with drug offending, it's not, it hasn't been very helpful with preventing relapse or repeated drug offenses. There have been found a lack of cultural sensitivity or identification and a prevention of biases. So some of these biases include community resources. Some people may not have as many resources as others, different things like transportation to the programs, or again, funding for the programs and different things like that. Some of them may not be as reliable. It may not serve the intended purpose. Again, some of them may not deter relapse or repeat offending at all, which is not the intended goal. There have been some low turnout rates and poor prevention of relapse in some of these programs that have been assessed. And education for juveniles and families were not very prioritized in the past. And there's also some issues with shame and labeling in the school system that kind of pushes these juveniles out of their education, which can be detrimental because they may be put behind or end up not being able to finish. Some improvements for the future that I found within the studies that I researched, and also some that I think will be important, would be to consider integrating trauma and PTSD treatment in these programs, because again, trauma and PTSD was found as a risk factor in these environments. To integrate other mental health treatment programs and resources. Mental health is very important in trying to prevent or identify potential, drug addiction. To integrate education into these programs. So juvenile education, one thing that the family treatment model suggests is parenting skills, because neglect and lack of supervision and also family abuse was also a high risk factor for juvenile drug offending and sobriety. And to integrate family-based treatment or therapy to help with dealing with all issues influencing drug abuse. So implementing a multi-level solution. So not just focusing on juveniles, not just focusing on parents, but also focusing on ending the cycle within the family altogether. Also mandatory program evaluations every 2 to 3 years, just to make sure that these programs are being reliable and actually helping the communities that they intend to serve. And to ensure culturally sensitive programs that accommodates the needs of all families. So there needs to be not like a one size fits all solution. There needs to be consideration for individual families themselves, such as poverty, their backgrounds, transportation needs, and employment needs. So there's further research needed that I identified. So some were trauma effects on the completion or failure of drug court programs, integration of education for these juveniles and their families or parents. Biases need to be addressed within these programs, and potential triggers for relapse also need to be considered. So I had 2 discussion questions. So the first one is, what biases do you think would be common within these programs, and what solutions do you think could be used to resolve those biases? Oops.
Andrea, do you want some help trying to stop the share?
Oh, sure.
Or, oh, you got it.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you for sharing. Just my daughter is still doing DARE classes, and I'm curious if it's ineffective, why they're still doing that or not trying something else. But do you think over this last year with COVID, drug abuse has changed in this country?
I'm sorry, it kind of broke up.
Oh, do you think drug use has changed this last year with COVID?
I think that COVID introduced a lot of new stressors for different people and their families. I've been looking at intra-family violence in another class, and a lot of times it has gone unreported this last year because people are not able to get out and get resources. So I don't know the research on how COVID has changed, but I'm thinking it could have gone either way, that those new stresses have increased, and also with people not having resources or availability to get to these programs, that it could have been increased, and it could have been decreased for a numerous amount of reasons, but that would be interesting to see in a few years if there's some criminal justice researchers doing research on that topic. Does anybody else have any other questions?
I just wanted to say that, like, I appreciate what you pointed out about the like interfamily trauma and drug use. Is that something that's so common that can be a barrier to both the parents and the child? And I think it's great that you looked at that.
Yes, it's very important, and especially because a lot of times the trauma and abuse can lead to a multiple of issues within a family. So it can repeat to cyclical trauma, like being repeated. It can lead to developmental problems, like we said, behavioral problems, and all of those things can kind of predispose people to maybe wanting to escape from those situations through drug abuse or substance use, which was found in a lot of these studies. So it is very important.
Well, thank you guys for your presentations and your research. We've got 15 minutes left if you guys want to jump into a different session and see if something is interesting for you. I hope you have a good day and are enjoying the conference. Thanks for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right.
Take care.
Everyone.
Bye.